"Emily, the oven," my mom said without even looking at me, her hand wrapped around a wine glass, her voice light and casual like she was asking someone to pass the salt. Except she wasn't talking to just anyone, she was talking to me, in front of 15 guests standing in our living room, coats draped over their arms, laughter filling the space while I stood there in the kitchen doorway with flour still on my hands, heat from the oven pressing against my face. And for a second I didn't move. I just stood there because it hit me all at once, not the request, not even the tone, but the way everyone else reacted or didn't react, like it was normal, like it made perfect sense that I would be the one to disappear into the kitchen while everyone else stayed where the light was, where the conversation was, where the family was supposed to be. And I remember thinking, this is what I am to them, not a daughter, not even a guest, just the person who keeps things running in the background. The one who makes sure everything looks perfect. And I turned without saying anything because that's what I always did. I walked back into the kitchen, and I checked the oven like I was told, like I had been told every single year, every single holiday, every birthday, every family dinner. Because in this house I wasn't part of the celebration, I was the reason it could happen, and the worst part is, it didn't happen all at once. It wasn't like one day they decided I was the help. It was small things, tiny moments that stacked on top of each other until they became something I couldn't ignore anymore. Like the way I was always the first one up on Thanksgiving morning, standing in the kitchen at 6 a.m. while the rest of the house was still asleep, prepping a turkey that weighed almost 20 pounds, peeling potatoes, setting out dishes I wasn't even allowed to use, and by the time everyone came downstairs, dressed and smiling and ready to sit, I was already exhausted, already invisible, and no one ever asked me to sit down. They just assumed I wouldn't, because I never did, because someone had to refill the drinks, someone had to clear the plates, someone had to make sure everything looked effortless, and that someone was always me. And if I'm being honest, I let it happen for a long time. I told myself it meant I was needed, that I had a role, that this was how I showed love. But there's a difference between being needed and being used, and I didn't understand that yet, not until moments like this started to feel heavier, harder to ignore, like when my mom laughed with her friends and said, "Emily's our little lifesaver in the kitchen." And everyone smiled like it was a compliment, like it was something I should be proud of, and I smiled too, because that's what you do when you don't want to make things uncomfortable, when you don't want to admit that something inside you just cracked a little. And I went back to stirring, back to checking timers, back to making sure everything was perfect for people who barely noticed I was there. And across the room I could see my sister Ashley, standing by the fireplace, laughing, her glass always full, her hands always empty, the center of attention like she'd been her entire life. And no one ever asked her to check the oven, no one ever asked her to do anything except show up and be admired. And for a long time I told myself that was just how things were, that every family had their roles, that mine just happened to be behind the scenes. But that night, standing there with the oven light glowing and the noise of laughter bleeding into the kitchen, something shifted, something small but sharp, like a thought I couldn't push away anymore, because for the first time I didn't just feel tired, I felt done. And I didn't realize it then, not fully, but that Christmas, the one where my mom asked me to check the oven like I was part of the staff instead of the family, that was the last time I ever stepped into that kitchen for them again. I woke up at 5:30 the next morning out of habit, not because anyone asked me to, not because there was a list waiting for me on the kitchen counter like there usually was, but because my body had learned this rhythm after years of being the first one awake on days that were supposed to belong to everyone. And for a few seconds, lying there staring at the ceiling, I forgot what I had felt the night before. I forgot the way something inside me had shifted, and then it came back, quiet but steady, like a decision that had already been made somewhere deeper than my thoughts. And I did not get out of bed right away, which in itself felt strange, almost wrong, like I was breaking a rule no one had ever said out loud but everyone expected me to follow. And I could already imagine the kitchen downstairs, empty, dark, waiting, and for the first time I let it wait. I turned onto my side, pulled the blanket a little higher, and listened to the house instead of rushing to serve it. And it was silent, the kind of silence that usually never lasted long, because I would have already filled it with the sound of cabinets opening, water running, the low hum of the oven preheating. But now there was nothing, and I realized something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not quite name. They had never once woken up early for me, not for my birthday, not for anything that mattered to me, but I had done it for them every single time without question. And I sat up slowly, not because I had somewhere to be, but because I needed to feel what it was like to move without being pulled by someone else's expectations. And when I walked past the mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself, hair still messy, face bare, and I looked tired, not just from yesterday but from years of saying yes without ever being asked if I wanted to. And downstairs I could hear movement starting, doors opening, footsteps, my mom's voice faint and cheerful in a way it always was when guests were coming over. And I knew what would happen next. I knew the pattern so well it felt like a script I had memorized. She would walk into the kitchen, pause, notice that nothing had been started, and then she would call my name, not loudly, not angrily, just casually, like it was obvious I should already be there. And I stood at the top of the stairs listening, my hand resting on the railing, and right on cue I heard it. "Emily," followed by a small pause, then again a little louder. "Emily, are you up?" And there it was, that expectation wrapped in a simple question, and for a second I almost answered, I almost stepped down, almost slipped back into the role that had defined me for so long. But I did not move. I stayed exactly where I was because something inside me was holding me in place, something stronger than habit, stronger than guilt. And then I heard Ashley's voice, light, amused. "She is probably still asleep, Mom," followed by a soft laugh, like it was funny, like it was ridiculous for me not to already be working. And I felt that familiar sting, the one that usually pushed me into action, but this time it did not move me forward, it just sat there, sharp and clear, and I let it exist without trying to fix it. And downstairs I could hear cabinets opening now, a little faster, a little louder, my mom moving around in a way that was not quite as effortless as it usually was, and I realized they did not actually know how to do this without me, not really, not the way they liked it done, not the way that made everything look perfect, and for years I had thought that meant I was needed. But standing there, listening to the slight strain in her movements, I understood something different. They had never learned because they never had to, because I was always there, filling in every gap before it could even be noticed. And that morning, for the first time, I did not fill the gap, I let it stay empty, and I did not realize then just how loud that silence would become. By 7:15 the house no longer sounded calm, it sounded uncertain, like something was slightly off, but no one wanted to say it out loud. And I stayed upstairs just long enough to hear the shift, the way my mom's voice lost that effortless brightness and picked up a sharper edge, not angry yet, just strained, like she was trying to keep everything under control without admitting she could not. And I walked down the stairs slowly, not rushing, not apologizing, just stepping into the space as myself instead of as the solution to everything. And the moment I entered the kitchen, I saw it, the counters still empty, no mixing bowls, no trays lined up, no ingredients measured out in neat rows the way I always had them by sunrise, just a carton of eggs sitting unopened and a cutting board pushed to the side like it had been picked up and put down without a plan. And my mom turned toward me immediately, relief flashing across her face for a split second before it settled into something more familiar, expectation. "Emily, there you are," she said, like I had been late to something I never agreed to, and I nodded once, calm, quiet, and for a moment neither of us said anything else, because I think she was waiting for me to step forward, to pick up where I had left off in every other year, to move automatically into the role that made everything work. But I did not move, I just stood there. And that small pause stretched longer than it should have, long enough for her expression to change again, confusion this time. "Did you start anything yet?" she asked, her tone light but thinner now. And I shook my head, just once, no explanation, no apology, and the silence that followed felt louder than any argument we had ever had. And behind her, I could see Ashley leaning against the counter, scrolling on her phone, barely looking up, like none of this concerned her, like it never had. And my dad walked in a second later, adjusting his watch, glancing around the kitchen with a quick scan that landed on me and then on the empty counters, and I saw it register, not fully, not yet, just a flicker of something off script, and he cleared his throat. "What is the plan for breakfast?" he asked, not directly at me but not at me either, and my mom answered before I could say anything. Emily was just about to start. And there it was, the assumption spoken out loud, handed to me like it always had been. And I could feel all the years behind that sentence, every time I had stepped in without question, every time I had made it easy for them to believe this was just how things worked. And I looked at her, really looked this time, at the way she held herself like everything depended on me without ever acknowledging it, and I said quietly, "I am not cooking today." And the words did not come out dramatic or angry, they came out simple, steady, like a fact I had already accepted. And for a second no one reacted, like the sentence had not fully landed yet. And then Ashley looked up, eyebrows lifting just slightly, more surprised than concerned, and my dad frowned, not deeply, just enough to show something was off, and my mom blinked once, twice, like she was recalibrating. "What do you mean?" she asked, a small laugh tucked into the question, like she expected me to correct myself, like this was a misunderstanding that would fix itself in the next second. But I did not correct anything, I just stood there, hands empty, not reaching for a pan, not opening the fridge, not filling the silence the way I always had. And I realized something in that moment that I had never allowed myself to see before. The entire system of this house depended on me acting like I did not have a choice. And the second I stopped, even for one morning, everything started to feel unstable, not broken, not yet, but unsettled in a way they were not prepared for, and I did not know exactly how far that shift would go. But I knew one thing for certain: I was not going to fix it this time. For a moment no one moved, like the entire kitchen had paused around my sentence, and I could see it on their faces, not anger yet, not even disappointment, just confusion, like I had stepped out of a role they assumed I would play forever. And my mom let out a small laugh, the kind people use when something does not make sense. "Emily, do not be difficult," she said, her tone still soft but tighter now. And I recognized that tone. It was the one she used when she expected compliance, not conversation, and I felt that old instinct rise up in me, the urge to smooth things over, to say never mind, to step forward and fix everything before it became a problem. But I stayed where I was, and that silence between us stretched again, longer this time, heavier, and my dad shifted his weight, glancing at the clock on the wall like time itself might solve this for him. "We have people coming in less than an hour," he said, not raising his voice, just stating a fact that was supposed to push me into action. And for years it would have. For years that sentence alone would have been enough to send me moving, grabbing pans, turning on burners, doing whatever needed to be done to make sure everything was ready on time. But this time I just nodded once, acknowledging the fact without accepting the responsibility that usually came with it, and that seemed to unsettle him more than if I had argued. Because there was nothing to push against, nothing to correct, just a quiet refusal that did not fit into the way things usually worked. And Ashley finally looked up fully now, her phone lowering just enough for her to watch me with a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "What is this about?" she asked, like I was creating unnecessary drama over something small, something obvious, and I met her gaze for a second before looking back at my mom. Because this was not about Ashley, it had never really been about her. She just benefited from a system I helped maintain. And my mom exhaled slowly, her patience thinning. "Emily, we all do our part," she said, and that sentence almost made me smile, not because it was funny, but because it was so far from the truth it felt unreal hearing it out loud. And I thought about every holiday, every dinner, every moment where our part had meant something entirely different depending on who you were in this house, and I realized something that made my chest feel strangely light. I did not have to argue this. I did not have to list everything I had done or explain why it mattered, because deep down they already knew. They just never had to face it, and now they were. And that discomfort was not mine to fix. And I could hear movement in the living room now, voices starting to fill the space, coats rustling, the first guests arriving earlier than expected, and my mom's eyes flicked toward the doorway, calculation replacing confusion as she tried to hold everything together, to keep the image intact, and she stepped closer to me, lowering her voice just enough so it would not carry. "We will talk about this later," she said, firm now. Controlled, "Just start breakfast." And there it was, the final attempt to restore order, to push everything back into place until it could be dealt with privately, quietly, without disrupting the version of our family she wanted everyone else to see. And for a second I understood exactly what she was asking, not just for help, but for silence, for me to continue being invisible so everything else could look perfect. And I shook my head again, slower this time. "No," I said, just one word. Calm and clear, and something in her expression shifted in a way I had never seen before. Not just frustration but uncertainty, because for the first time, I was not cooperating with the unspoken rules that held everything together. And behind her, I could see my dad straighten slightly, his attention sharpening now that the situation was no longer something that would quietly resolve itself, and the sound of the front door opening echoed into the kitchen, followed by cheerful voices calling out greetings, and I realized that whatever happened next was not going to stay contained in this room, because the moment they had always relied on me to manage was already slipping out of their control, and this time I was not stepping in to save it. The front door opened wider and the sound of cold air and cheerful voices rushed into the house, coats being shaken off, laughter spilling into the hallway, and my mom moved instantly, her posture shifting like a switch had flipped, her smile appearing as if nothing had just happened, as if the kitchen behind her was not completely unprepared. "Merry Christmas," she called out warmly, stepping away from me like the conversation we had just had could be paused and tucked away. And I stood there, watching her greet everyone, watching how easily she stepped into that version of herself, the perfect host, the one everyone admired, and for a moment it almost made me question myself, almost made me wonder if I was overreacting, if maybe I should just step in quietly and make everything easier like I always did. But then I looked back at the kitchen, at the empty counters, at the unopened ingredients, and I remembered exactly how we got here, and I stayed still, and one by one, guests began to filter into the living room, their voices carrying toward the kitchen, casual comments about how good everything smelled every year, how they could not wait for breakfast, and I could feel the expectation building in the air, not just from my family now but from everyone, because this had become part of the tradition, something they all counted on without ever seeing what it cost, and my dad stepped into the living room, shaking hands, making small talk, but I noticed the way his eyes flicked back toward the kitchen more than once, quick, controlled glances like he was checking on something that should have already been handled, and Ashley followed behind him, laughing with a group of guests, completely at ease, like nothing was different, like nothing needed to be done. And that contrast hit me harder than anything else, because it showed me how deeply this had been normalized, how invisible my role had become even to the people who benefited from it the most. And I heard one of my mom's friends call out, "Linda, it smells amazing already." And there was a brief pause, just a second before my mom answered, "It will be ready soon." Her voice still bright but with a slight strain underneath that only someone paying attention would notice, and I realized she was buying time, hoping I would step in at the last moment, hoping I would not let things go this far, and I could feel the weight of that expectation pressing on me. Again, heavier now, because it was not just about our family anymore, it was about the image they were trying to maintain in front of everyone else, and for years that pressure had been enough to make me fold, to make me fix everything before anyone could see the cracks. But this time I let the cracks show, I let the silence in the kitchen stretch, I let the absence of food become noticeable, and it did not take long. Someone walked toward the kitchen, curious, maybe looking for coffee or something to snack on, and I saw the moment they realized, the slight hesitation as they took in the empty space, the lack of preparation, the way things were not lining up with what they expected, and they glanced at me just briefly, like they were trying to understand what was happening, and I met their gaze without explaining, without rushing to fill the gap. And they stepped back into the living room a second later, their voice lower now as they spoke to someone else, and I could feel the shift spreading, subtle at first like a ripple moving through the room, and my mom reappeared in the doorway, her smile tighter now, her eyes finding mine immediately, and there was something different there this time, not just expectation, not just frustration, but something closer to urgency, because for the first time she was not sure she could control how this would play out, and she stepped closer again, her voice low but firm. "Emily, we cannot do this right now," she said, emphasizing the word cannot like it was not an option, like the situation itself demanded that I give in, and I understood what she meant, not just about breakfast but about the entire performance, the entire structure of how things worked in this house, and I realized that if I gave in now, even a little, everything would go back to the way it had always been, and nothing would actually change. And I looked past her into the living room at the people laughing, waiting, expecting something that was not coming. And I felt something settle inside me, something calm and certain, and I shook my head one more time, because this was the moment everything either stayed the same or finally shifted, and I was not going back. My mom's expression changed in a way I had never seen before, not because I had said anything louder or harsher, but because I had not moved, and for the first time, she realized I was not going to fix this, and that realization made the room feel smaller, tighter, like something invisible had shifted and no one knew how to adjust. And she glanced past me toward the empty stove, the cold oven, the untouched counters, and then back toward the living room where voices were starting to overlap. Questions mixing into the laughter, subtle at first but growing, and my dad stepped back into the kitchen again. His smile gone now, replaced by something more controlled, more deliberate, the version of him that handled problems instead of pretending they did not exist, and he looked at me directly this time, not around me, not past me, but at me. "Emily," he said, steady, firm. "This is not the time for this." And I understood what he meant, because in his world timing was everything, appearances were everything, and this moment right now in front of guests was the worst possible time to disrupt the system that made everything look perfect. But the truth was, there would never be a right time, there would always be a reason to wait, to postpone, to keep things quiet, and that was exactly how it had stayed this way for so long. And I could feel that old pressure again, the weight of responsibility that was never officially mine but always somehow ended up on me. And I let myself feel it fully without pushing it away, because for years I had confused that feeling with love, with duty, with being part of something. But standing there, I finally saw it for what it was: expectation without acknowledgement, dependence without respect. And I shook my head again, slower this time, not in defiance, not in anger, just in certainty. And that seemed to frustrate him more than anything else, because there was nothing emotional to react to, nothing dramatic to shut down. Just a calm refusal that did not fit into his usual way of resolving things. And behind him, I could see my mom trying to hold the living room together. Her voice slightly louder now, overcompensating, offering coffee, offering juice, filling space with movement instead of food, and it was not working the way she wanted it to because people were starting to notice, really notice, and Ashley finally stepped forward, crossing her arms lightly, her tone still casual but edged now with something sharper. "Seriously, Emily, what is your problem?" she asked, like this was about attitude, about mood, about something temporary that could be brushed off if I would just cooperate. And for a second I almost answered her, almost explained everything, all the years, all the moments, all the ways I had been pushed into this role without ever being asked if I wanted it. But I realized something in that moment that stopped me. They were not asking because they wanted to understand, they were asking because they wanted me to go back to normal. And explaining would only give them more room to dismiss it, to minimize it, to turn it into something small. And I did not need them to understand for this to be real. I just needed to stop participating in it. And I looked at her, then at my dad, then at my mom, and I said quietly, "This is not my responsibility." And the words felt heavier than anything I had said before, not because they were loud but because they were clear, and I could see the impact of them land differently on each of them. Confusion on my mom, irritation on Ashley, something more complicated on my dad, like he was trying to process a shift he had not anticipated. And from the living room a voice called out, "Is everything okay in there?" Light, curious, but caring just enough to make the situation impossible to ignore now. And I felt the moment tip, the balance of everything we had been holding together for years starting to lean in a direction none of them were prepared for. And for the first time I did not feel responsible for stopping it. The question from the living room hung in the air longer than it should have, simple words that suddenly carried weight, and my mom turned immediately, her smile snapping back into place like it had been rehearsed. "Everything is fine," she called out quickly, her voice just a little too bright, just a little too fast, and I could hear it now, the difference, the subtle crack underneath the performance, the strain of holding something together that was already slipping. And my dad stepped slightly closer to me, lowering his voice even more, his tone controlled but firmer now. "We will deal with this after," he said, each word measured like he was giving an order disguised as a compromise. And for a moment I understood exactly how this always worked: delay the problem, contain it, fix appearances first, truth later if ever. And that realization made something inside me settle even deeper, because I knew if I agreed to that, even silently, even by stepping forward and picking up pan, nothing would actually change. It would just be postponed again, pushed back into the same invisible space where everything I felt had always been kept. And I could feel the eyes of the room starting to shift toward the kitchen now, not all at once, but enough to be noticed, conversation slowing slightly, curiosity building, and Ashley let out a small sigh, stepping forward like she was about to take control of the situation in her own way. "Oh my God, it is not that serious," she said, rolling her eyes slightly, like this was just me being dramatic, like it was something she could smooth over with a joke or a dismissive comment. And she reached for a cabinet, opening it halfway before pausing, because even she did not know where things were kept, not really, not the way I did, not the way you do when you are the one who has always been responsible for everything behind the scenes. And that moment, that tiny hesitation, said more than anything else could have, because it showed exactly how much they depended on something they barely acknowledged. And I watched her close the cabinet again, her confidence slipping just a fraction. And my mom stepped back into the kitchen, her movements quicker now, more urgent, grabbing a coffee mug, filling it, handing it off to someone passing by, trying to redirect attention, trying to buy more time. And I realized she was still waiting, still hoping I would step in at the last second, that I would not let this go far enough to actually disrupt the image she had built. And for years that hope had always been enough, because I never let things fall apart. I never let the silence grow this loud. But this time I let it stretch. I let the absence of action become undeniable. And I could see it spreading now, the awareness, the quiet realization among the guests that something was not quite right, that the usual rhythm of this house was missing a beat. And one of my dad's friends leaned slightly toward the kitchen doorway, his voice casual but curious. "Need a hand in there?" he asked, and that question landed differently because it was not directed at me, it was directed at the situation itself, at the gap that had been exposed. And for the first time, someone else was seeing it, even if they did not fully understand it yet. And my mom forced a quick laugh. No, we have it," she said, but there was a tightness in her voice now that she could not hide. And I could feel the tension building, not explosive, not dramatic, just steady and uncomfortable, like something that had been ignored for too long was finally being noticed. And I stood there, not hiding, not stepping back, just present in a way I had never allowed myself to be before. And I realized that this was not just about breakfast, it was about every moment that had led up to this, every time I had chosen silence over discomfort, Every time I had made things easier for everyone else at the cost of myself. And now that I had stopped even for a few hours, everything felt different, unbalanced, exposed, and my dad exhaled slowly, running a hand along the edge of the counter like he was grounding himself, recalculating, and when he looked at me again there was something new in his expression, not understanding, not yet, but awareness, like he was beginning to see that this was not a small problem he could solve with a few firm words. And the room behind him grew quieter by another degree, just enough to be felt, and I knew we had crossed a point where this could no longer be brushed aside. Because for the first time, the role I had always played was empty and everyone could see it. It did not explode the way people imagine these moments do. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a slow unraveling that everyone could feel but no one knew how to stop, and that made it worse because there was nothing to hide behind, no noise to distract from what was actually happening. And my mom moved faster now, opening drawers, closing them, pulling out a pan and then setting it back down like she was trying to remember something she had never really learned, and I could see the frustration building in small, controlled movements, the kind that only showed when things were slipping out of control, and my dad stepped back toward the living room again, forcing a smile as he spoke to his guests, but it did not hold the way it usually did. There was a tightness in his voice now, a slight delay before he responded to simple questions, and people noticed that, even if they did not say it out loud, and Ashley shifted her weight beside me, glancing between me and the kitchen like she was trying to decide if this was still something she could dismiss or if it had become something else entirely. And for the first time I saw uncertainty in her expression too, not because she understood what I was doing, but because she was realizing that the structure she relied on was not as stable as she thought. And another guest stepped toward the kitchen doorway, peeking in with a polite smile. "Do you need help getting things started?" she asked, her tone kind but curious, and my mom shook her head quickly, too quickly. No, everything is under control," she said, but her hands were empty, and the stove was still cold, and the gap between her words and reality was becoming harder to ignore. And I stood there watching it all unfold, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with a kind of quiet clarity I had never felt before, because for years I had thought I was the only one who saw how this worked, how everything depended on me staying silent and stepping in. But now that I had stepped back even slightly, the truth was visible to everyone, not in a dramatic way, but in the small inconsistencies that could not be covered up, and I realized something that shifted everything for me. They were not just expecting me to help, they were expecting me to disappear into the role I had always played, to make it look effortless, to make them look complete. And without that, the entire image felt unfinished, and I could hear someone in the living room laugh awkwardly, the kind of laugh people use when something feels off but they are not sure why. And my mom's movements grew sharper, more deliberate, like she was trying to force control back into the situation through sheer effort. And she finally reached for a pan again, turning on the stove with a quick motion, but even that felt out of place, too late, too unprepared, because the rhythm was gone, the flow that I had always created before anyone even noticed it was needed. And my dad stepped back into the kitchen once more, his voice lower now, more direct. "We are not doing this today," he said, not loud but firm enough to carry weight, and I looked at him, really looked this time, and I saw something I had not noticed before, not just authority, not just expectation, but dependence, a reliance he had never acknowledged because he never had to. And I understood in that moment that this was not just uncomfortable for them, it was destabilizing, because the role I had filled so quietly for so long had become something they did not know how to replace. And I did not argue, I did not explain, I just stayed where I was, present and unmoving, and that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. Because there was no reaction he could manage, no behavior he could correct, just a shift he could not control, and behind him, the room had grown quieter again, the conversation softer, the attention drifting back toward the kitchen in subtle, undeniable ways, and I realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward, not just today, not just this breakfast, but years of quiet imbalance finally becoming visible. And for the first time I was not trying to fix it. By the time the clock on the wall clicked past 8:30, the shift was impossible to ignore, the kind of quiet disruption that does not need to be announced because everyone can feel it settling into the room, and the conversations in the living room had lost their rhythm, no longer flowing easily but breaking into smaller, uncertain exchanges, people glancing toward the kitchen more often now, their expectations slowly turning into questions they were too polite to ask directly. And my mom stood at the stove with a pan that had just begun to warm, her movements no longer smooth or confident but rushed and uneven, like she was trying to catch up to a moment that had already passed. And I could see it in the way she reached for ingredients without a plan, opening the refrigerator, pausing, closing it again, her mind racing through something she had never had to fully think through before. because for years, I had already done that part for her before. She even noticed it was needed, and my dad had stopped pretending everything was under control, his posture straighter now, his voice quieter when he spoke to guests, offering short answers instead of leading conversations, because he could feel it too, the attention shifting away from him and toward the absence behind him, and Ashley stood near the edge of the kitchen now, no longer relaxed, her phone lowered completely, her expression caught somewhere between annoyance and discomfort, like she was realizing this was not going to resolve itself the way she expected, and one of the guests, an older woman who had been coming to our Christmas gatherings for years, stepped closer to the doorway again, her voice gentle but direct this time. "Is there anything I can help with?" she asked, and there was something different in her tone now, not just politeness but awareness, like she could see the gap and was offering to step into it. And my mom hesitated, just for a second, and that hesitation said everything, because accepting help would mean admitting something was wrong, admitting that the system she had relied on was not working, and she shook her head quickly, forcing a smile again. "No, really, we have it," she said, but her voice did not carry the same confidence anymore. And I realized that the illusion was breaking, not in a dramatic way, but in small, undeniable pieces, and I stood there, still not moving, still not stepping in, and for the first time I could see the full shape of what I had been holding together all these years, not just meals or events, but the entire experience of what people believed this family was, and without me quietly maintaining it, that image was starting to look incomplete, unfinished, and I thought about all the times I had been told I was helpful, reliable, good in the kitchen, words that sounded like compliments but always kept me in the same place, always defined me by what I did for others instead of who I was. And I felt something shift again, deeper this time, because I realized I had been accepting those labels as my identity, and letting them limit me in ways I had never questioned, and now that I had stepped outside of them, even just for a few hours, everything felt different, not easier, not comfortable, but clearer, and my dad finally looked at me again. His expression more serious now, less controlled, like he was starting to understand that this was not a temporary situation, not something that would resolve with a few firm words or a quiet agreement, and he took a step closer, lowering his voice again. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said, and that sentence almost made me smile, because for the first time I could hear it clearly, not as a statement about the situation but as a reflection of their expectations, because what he really meant was that I was no longer making it easy for them, and I realized that ease had always come at my expense, and I was done paying that cost. And I looked at him steady, calm, and I did not argue, I did not explain, I just stood there, and in that silence, I could feel the moment stretching further, the gap widening, the reality becoming harder to ignore, and I did not realize then just how much that gap would change everything that came after. The moment stretched past the point where anyone could pretend this was normal, and I could feel it settling into the room like a quiet realization that no one wanted to name out loud, because naming it would make it real, and my mom's movements slowed, not because she had figured anything out, but because she was running out of ways to pretend everything was under control, and the pan on the stove sat there heating unevenly, empty, a small visible symbol of everything that was missing, and my dad stepped away from me again, this time not toward the guests, but toward the edge of the kitchen, like he was trying to see the situation from a different angle, trying to understand something that had never required his attention before. And Ashley crossed her arms tighter now, her usual ease gone completely, replaced by irritation she could not hide anymore. And the living room had shifted again, the laughter quieter, more spaced out, conversations breaking off sooner, replaced by glances and low voices, and I could hear someone say, "I thought breakfast was already started." Not loudly, not accusing, just confused, and that confusion carried more weight than any confrontation could have, because it exposed the expectation that had always been there without ever being questioned. And my mom turned back toward me one more time, her expression no longer trying to hide anything, not from me at least. "Emily, please," she said, and that word landed differently than everything else she had said that morning. Not because it was softer, but because it was unfamiliar, because it was the first time she had asked instead of assumed, and for a second something inside me reacted to that, not enough to change my decision but enough to recognize the shift, because it showed me that even she could feel the difference, even she could see that the usual dynamic was not working anymore. And I held her gaze steady, not cold, not distant, just present, and I realized I did not need to argue or explain anything else. The situation itself was already saying everything for me, and behind her, I could see one of the guests step forward again, this time not waiting to be told no, but moving into the kitchen with a polite smile, reaching for a coffee pot, offering to help in a way that felt natural to them, but completely foreign to how things had always worked here. And that small action changed something because it broke the pattern even further. It showed that the role I had always filled was not inevitable. It was just something everyone had accepted without question, and now that it was gone, other possibilities were starting to appear, even if they were awkward, even if they did not fit the image my family had built. And my dad watched that interaction closely, his expression tightening slightly, not out of anger but out of recognition, like he was beginning to understand that control over this situation was slipping, not dramatically but steadily, and I could see the calculation in his eyes, the realization that this was no longer just about breakfast, it was about perception, about how this moment would be remembered, and I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me because for the first time I was not managing that perception for them. I was not smoothing things over, not adjusting myself to protect the image they cared about, and the longer I stood there without moving, the clearer it became to everyone else that something had changed, something fundamental, and I could see it reflected back at me in small ways, in the way people hesitated before speaking, in the way their attention lingered a little longer on the kitchen than it normally would, and I realized that this was the turning point, not because anything dramatic had happened but because nothing had been fixed, nothing had been hidden, and for the first time, the truth of how things worked in this house was visible to more than just me. And I did not know exactly what would come next, but I knew one thing for certain: there was no going back to the way things had been before. The kitchen no longer felt like the center of the house. It felt like a space everyone was aware of but unsure how to step into, and that uncertainty spread in quiet, uncomfortable ways, people shifting their weight, glancing at one another before speaking, lowering their voices like they were trying to stay polite without fully ignoring what was happening. And I watched as the guest who had stepped in earlier poured coffee carefully, offering cups to others, filling a role that had always been mine without even realizing it, and there was something strange about seeing that, not painful, not upsetting, just clarifying, because it showed me that the function I had served was never about me as a person, it was about what needed to be done, and anyone could step into it if they chose to, but I had been the only one expected to do it without question. And my mom stood near the counter now, her movements slower, more deliberate, like she was trying to regain some sense of control without fully knowing how, and I could see the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders held tension instead of ease, the way her smile came and went instead of staying steady, and my dad finally stopped moving altogether, standing near the edge of the kitchen with his arms resting lightly at his sides, not crossing them, not gesturing, just watching, and that stillness felt different, like he was no longer trying to manage the situation but trying to understand it, and Ashley had stepped back slightly, no longer trying to dismiss or fix anything, her attention fixed on the space between me and our parents, like she was realizing that whatever was happening was not something she could smooth over with a comment or ignore with a shrug, and the room had settled into a new kind of quiet, not empty, but aware, like everyone could sense that this was not just a small disruption but something deeper, something that had been building for a long time and was only now becoming visible. And I felt that awareness too, not as pressure but as clarity, because for the first time, I was not trying to interpret their reactions or adjust myself to fit them. I was simply standing in my own space, letting the situation unfold without taking responsibility for how it affected everyone else. And my mom finally spoke again, her voice softer now, less controlled. "I did not realize you felt this way," she said, and those words landed differently than anything else she had said that morning. Not because they fixed anything, but because they acknowledged something, even if it was incomplete, even if it came too late to change what had already happened. And I looked at her, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a kind of steady honesty I had never allowed myself to show before, and I realized that I did not need to correct her or fill in the gaps of what she did not understand, because the truth was already there, visible in the empty counters, in the uneven rhythm of the morning, in the way everyone had been forced to notice something they had always overlooked, and I could feel the moment settling into something more permanent now, not just an awkward situation, but a shift in how things were seen, how they were understood. And my dad exhaled slowly, a quiet breath that carried more weight than any words he had spoken, and when he finally looked at me again, there was something different in his expression, not agreement, not acceptance, but recognition, like he was beginning to see a part of this dynamic he had never questioned before. And I realized that this was the point where everything changed, not because they suddenly understood me, but because they could no longer ignore what had always been there. And I stood there, still and certain, knowing that whatever came next would not be built on the same silent expectations that had defined everything before. Something in the room settled after that, Not in a way that fixed anything, but in a way that made everything feel more real, more grounded, like whatever had been hidden under routine and expectation had finally been brought into the open and could not be pushed back down again. And the guests slowly began to adjust, not dramatically, not with questions or confrontation, but in small, quiet ways. Someone offered to slice fruit they found in the refrigerator. Another person set out cups and plates, movements that were tentative at first but grew more natural as the moment stretched on. And I watched it happen with a kind of calm detachment, not because I did not care, but because for the first time I was not responsible for making it work, and that difference changed everything about how it felt to stand there, because I was no longer anticipating what needed to be done next or stepping in before anyone noticed something was missing. I was simply present, observing a system reorganizing itself without me at the center of it, and my mom stood quietly for a moment longer before finally stepping back from the counter, her shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in something closer to acceptance, like she was realizing that forcing things back into their usual pattern was not going to work this time. And my dad moved toward the guests again, his tone more measured now, less performative, as if he had stopped trying to maintain an image and was instead focusing on navigating what was actually happening. And Ashley lingered near the kitchen doorway, her expression thoughtful in a way I had never seen before, like she was seeing the situation from a different angle, not fully understanding it yet, but no longer dismissing it either, and I could feel the atmosphere shift again, not back to what it had been, but into something quieter, more honest, even if it was uncomfortable. And for a moment I wondered what this would look like later, after the guests had left, after the house was quiet again, when there would be no distractions, no performance to maintain, just the four of us and the reality of what had changed. And that thought did not scare me the way it used to, because I was not carrying the same weight anymore. I was not preparing myself to explain or justify or smooth things over. I was simply aware that whatever conversation came next would not be built on the same silence that had defined everything before. And I took a small step back from the kitchen, not retreating, just creating space, and as I did, I noticed how different the room felt from this distance, how the tension that had been so tightly focused on me earlier had begun to disperse, spreading out into something more shared, more balanced, and I realized that this was the real shift, not just that I had stopped doing something, but that the responsibility for everything no longer rested on me alone, and that realization brought a kind of quiet relief that I had never allowed myself to feel before, because I had always believed that stepping back would cause everything to fall apart completely, that without me nothing would function. But standing there now, I could see that things did not collapse, they changed, they adjusted imperfectly, unevenly, but they continued, and that meant something I had never fully considered before. That I had not been the only one capable of holding things together, I had just been the only one expected to, and for the first time, that expectation was no longer mine to carry. And as the voices in the living room slowly regained a new kind of rhythm, quieter but steadier, I understood that this was not the end of something, it was the beginning of a different way of being in this space, one where I was not invisible, not because anyone had suddenly changed, but because I had stopped allowing myself to disappear. The rest of the morning did not return to what it used to be, and that was the point, not in a dramatic, life-changing way that people imagine, but in something quieter and more lasting, like a shift in the foundation that everything else had been built on. And as the hours passed, the house slowly found a new rhythm, imperfect and uneven, people helping where they could, conversations picking up again but never quite reaching the same effortless tone they had before. And I stayed present without stepping back into the role I had left behind, not avoiding anyone, not hiding, just existing in the space as myself instead of as the solution to everything. And that difference was noticed, even if no one said it directly. And when the last guest finally gathered their coat and stepped out into the cold afternoon, leaving behind the quiet that always followed a gathering, the house felt different, not empty, but still like it was holding on to something that had not been resolved yet. And my mom moved slowly through the living room, collecting cups, straightening things that did not really need to be straightened, her movements thoughtful instead of automatic. And my dad stood near the window for a moment, looking out without speaking, his posture less rigid than it had been earlier, like he was no longer trying to control what had already shifted. And Ashley lingered near the couch, her phone in her hand but untouched, her attention drifting between all of us, and for a few seconds, none of us said anything, not because there was nothing to say, but because we all knew that whatever came next would not be the same kind of conversation we had always had, the kind that skimmed the surface and left everything else untouched. And my mom was the first to break the silence, her voice softer than I had ever heard it in this house. "I think we need to talk," she said, and there was no performance in it, no attempt to smooth things over or pretend everything was fine, just a simple acknowledgement that something had changed and could not be ignored, and I nodded once, not because I had rehearsed what I would say, but because for the first time I did not feel the need to prepare, to defend, or to minimize what I felt, and as we moved into the kitchen together, the same space that had defined so much of my role for so long, I noticed how different it felt now, not as a place I was expected to manage, but as a place where we were all standing on equal ground, uncertain but aware, and my dad finally spoke, his voice measured but less controlled than before. "We did not realize," he said, stopping there like the rest of the sentence did not come as easily as he expected, and that pause mattered because it showed that for the first time, he was not speaking from assumption, but from something closer to reflection, and Ashley glanced at me briefly before looking away, her usual confidence replaced by something quieter, something more thoughtful, and my mom took a small breath before continuing. "We should have seen it," she said, and those words were not perfect, they did not fix the past, but they acknowledged something that had never been acknowledged before, and I listened without interrupting, without rushing to respond, because this was not about winning an argument or proving a point, it was about allowing something new to exist where silence had been before, and I realized that the biggest change was not in them, not yet, but in me, in the way I was standing there without shrinking, without stepping back into old patterns, without taking responsibility for how they felt about what had happened, and that change made everything else possible, because no matter what they understood or did not understand, I was no longer willing to disappear to keep things comfortable. And as the conversation slowly began to unfold, uneven and imperfect but real, I understood something that stayed with me long after that day, that the moment I stopped accepting the role they had given me was the moment everything else had the chance to change, and even if it took time, even if it was not easy, it had already begun.